Hello friends, in this video I'm going to make some marquetry coasters, 32 of them to be precise. This could be a great beginner project for anyone curious about marquetry I think, and you don't need to make 32, but I did for Christmas purposes. The process for each leaf begins by constructing a blank, which is made up of a square of veneer cut in two diagonally and with one of the pieces flipped around, so the grain splays out from the center line like the veins of a leaf. I placed the two pieces on a scrap of plywood to elevate them a little from the work surface, and took a few tiny shavings with my block plane to ensure a tight seam. These were then taped together. I then cut off the bottom where the stem of the leaf will go, because that thin detail needs to be a separate piece with the grain direction along its length in order to not become too fragile. So there's the first leaf blank done, and now I need a background that this can contrast against. I chose a piece of walnut here where the sapwood meets the heartwood. I think that's a pretty cool look. I marked the size of the leaf, began by drawing in the stem and the tip, and then filled in the rest of the outline. It doesn't need to be incredibly symmetrical, in fact I want them all to be unique, so I'm just freehand drawing them, but of course you could use a real leaf as a template, or a photo of one. Next I slipped in a piece of thick paper between my motif and background. I'll explain the role of this in just a moment when we get to the sewing. The 3 layers, 2 veneers and a paper spacer, were taped into a little packet and set aside as I made a few more. Note that the tape holding the 2 halves of the leaves together is facing down. This is not critical, but it does simplify things later on. I made them in pairs, so there's 2 with the same background and foreground veneers and the same type of leaf depicted. With a little pile ready to be cut, I hopped over to the foot-powered scroll saw and began pedaling. This is a very simple machine. The pedal is connected directly to the sawing arms, so 1 foot movement equals 1 blade stroke. It's slow compared to an electric scroll saw, but a lot quieter, which is nice, and also a lot cheaper. The advantage it gives over using a handheld coping saw is the blade is held at a fixed angle to the table, so I can fully concentrate on feeding and controlling the workpiece using both hands. It has a much larger capacity as well, around 50 centimeters, but for small items like these that doesn't matter of course. These coasters could absolutely be cut with a coping saw. Whichever way you want to go, the key thing that makes this technique work is the angle of the table to the blade. If you cut squarely at 90 degrees through both leaf and background at the same time, you'll get an oversized hole in the background, 1 saw blade thickness larger than the inlaid piece all the way around. These blades are thin, but that would still be a very noticeable gap when glued up. By tilting the table, you start making a beveled cut, and when you've gone all the way around, the leaf is basically conical and the hole in the background too. If the angle is just right, they'll fit together without a gap. The thinner your veneers are, the steeper this angle has to be, and with 0.6mm materials, I'd have to tilt the table so far that the edges would become really fragile. That's where the paper spacer comes into play. By inserting something between the 2 layers, you can make a much less steep bevel, and it really has a massive impact. This paper is only 0.5 millimeter thick, but it allows me to tilt the table 15 degrees instead of 30 without the spacer. Alright, now I can lift out my leaf and the paper spacer, which is discarded, and then the leaf can be pressed into the background. I scrape away a little bit of fuzz around the sawn line on the backside, and then use the tape to hold it in place, still on the backside where we also have the original tape from making the blank. This is the side that will be glued to a substrate later, so it may seem strange to put the tape here, but it will make sense when we get there. Some types of leaves benefit from a little more time spent in making up the blank. This will become a maple leaf, and a few more grain directions make them look really good, without being any more difficult. It's just the same process a couple more times. I think the best result is achieved when the grain bisects the angle of the cuts in every piece, so no veins are parallel to the midrib, like in this version of the maple leaf fittingly constructed in maple veneer. These leaves need the stem to be sawn rather than knife cut, and here it is very important to not saw the contour of the stem, only the part that joins to the leaf. I enter and exit the cut through the waist. The outline of the leaf and stem must be done in one go at the next stage. The assembly was taped to a background and spacer, and when drawing the shape I made sure each major peak or vertex was placed at a midrib where two veneer pieces meet. And then I could assemble these. The walnut versions have European oak backgrounds. I think oak and walnut look so good together. The warmth of the oak accentuates the cold tone of the walnut. For the maple leaves, I picked a redder background veneer with a little bit of subtle curl figure. I don't know what species this is though. Another leaf that looks good with a couple more grain directions is the heart-shaped linden or European lime leaf. This one is made with just the sapwood from some walnut and a beech background. It also has a stem that was sawn into the leaf just like on the maples. But the majority of the coasters did get oak leaves. I just really like the look of them, and with their softly rounded shapes they were the most relaxing to cut. Here are a couple in European oak veneer, which is a touch more brown than American white oak and works well against both light and dark backgrounds. This is mahogany and maple veneers, respectively. When all the marquetry was cut, it was time to glue it to a substrate and backer. I chose a 4mm poplar plywood and 2mm cork for the backer. The first thing I need to do is to cover the front side of the marquetry in a single layer of tape, so I can take off all the small pieces from the back. I did it this way because if I had taped the front while building up the blank and cutting out the leaf, I'd have a thick and uneven tape layer here that would create uneven pressure on the glue. Worst case, the glue wouldn't properly bond in some places because of this. I think you can get around that by using a vacuum press, but I don't have one, so this is a method that works with normal woodworking clamps and cauls. I then spread the glue on my cork layer. Standard wood glue works perfectly for bonding cork to wood, and I'm using cork for these coasters as it is a grippy material that doesn't slide around on a table, and also a bit absorbent in case some condensation would drip off the edge. If this was just a picture to hang on a wall or a panel to use in a cabinet, I would use the cheapest veneer as a backer. If you don't glue anything at all to the back of the substrate, it has a very high risk of warping. I wrapped the glue up in parchment paper, the kind for baking trays, to prevent the coasters from sticking to my clamping cauls. These are just some offcuts, but I picked them because of their cup. I'm placing them so they bow away from the coasters in the middle and touch at the edges. This way I can use just a couple of clamps in the middle. The boards will flatten out and the tension in the cupped wood will spread the pressure to the edges. It's like a spring joint if you are familiar with that, but the cauls are sprung instead of the workpieces. This way each clamp does the job of at least two, and we're always short on clamps in this hobby. But I have 30 more of these to glue, and a few floors above me there's a very large book press. So I took all the remaining marquetry assemblies and put them together like a wooden patchwork to glue it up in one go. Then the front again gets covered in a single tape layer, making sure that every piece of wood is at least mostly under the tape before cleaning up the glue side. I also added one more piece of tape along the edge, wrapping around the substrate and cork backer to act as a hinge and make it easier to align the layers when gluing. A lot of glue goes down, carefully spreading it all to the edges. And then the other side. I placed more parchment paper in case of glue bleed through, and a piece of OSB finishes the sandwich. Then it goes into the press. This is an old cast iron beauty that I am fortunate enough to be allowed to use while attending art school. It has an impact mechanism for tightening beyond hand cranking, and with a 500 by 600 mm capacity it is very impressive for a book press. Still somewhat of a limitation for marquetry work though. I've thought a lot about presses, and I do think some sort of vacuum system is where I'll eventually end up, but that's a project still far off into the future. When the glue had dried, I took both the big and the small assembly out of the clamps, removed the tape, and trimmed some excess cork and veneer. I could then cut them up into the individual coasters. This could of course be done with a handsaw. I think I would go with a Japanese pull saw personally, but the patchwork approach lent itself well to a little bit of machine work, and I wanted to give these away for Christmas, so I was starting to feel some time pressure. I cleaned up the marquetry with a card scraper, getting rid of pencil lines and smoothing the surface. I then drew the final shapes. Some will be square with rounded corners and some will be fully circular. The time crunch again led me to the bandsaw, but this could have been done on a scroll saw as well, or for a fully hand tool approach, a coping saw. I sanded the edges to 240 grit. Took the sharp corners away, and then they were ready for finishing. I did a lot of reading to find an appropriate finish for coasters, but I couldn't find any consensus. Opinions range through the whole spectrum, from fully encapsulating them in epoxy to no finish at all. I ended up going with boiled linseed oil for a couple of reasons. Before doing the whole batch, I made a few tests and found that it doesn't make the coaster stick to hot cups, and it doesn't show condensation rings as much as varnish does. It's also a very cheap and easily applied finish that can be reapplied at any time when the surface needs a refresh without sanding the previous layer off. I think that's an important aspect when gifting things to non-woodworkers that aren't likely to take out a sander and dust mask for a couple of coasters. The downside is that it needs a few layers to give any protection. I did 4 coats on these. There's also the yellow cast that linseed oil gives, but for small things like coasters, I don't think that's nearly as offensive as it can be on a large piece of furniture. I coated the oil on the edges too, but not the back as I don't want to seal the cork. Finishing only one side is generally not good practice as it makes for uneven wood movement, potential for warping, but I haven't noticed any warping of my coasters, so it seems alright for these small items. So there we have it, a very simple marquetry project that I think would be an excellent way to dip a toe into the technique and make some unique gifts in the process too. Thanks for watching and Happy New Year!